Good day and welcome to JCC Sunday School's in session, where Sunday school matters to God. Please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel and be a part of the JCC family. Our lesson today is titled Obedience in Rest, and it's coming from Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 through 18. The covenant God established with Israel through Moses had a far-reaching effect. One of the outward signs of that covenant was a Sabbath commandment, which read, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy," in Exodus 20, verse 8. And in this study today, we will not only examine the Sabbath day in its relation to the Mosaic covenant, but we'll also consider the applications of that regulation to New Testament believers today as well. Our lesson today aims to strengthen our commitment to setting aside a day to worship God and to honor Him in special ways. Let's get into the lesson and see what it has to offer us today. Verse 12 reads, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbath ye shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doeth sanctify you." Verse 12 shows that again we see God speaking. And whenever God speaks, we need to stop and listen to what God has to say. The first part of verse 13 shows us the Lord reinforcing the commandment of the Sabbath that he had already given to Moses. He says, "Verily my Sabbath ye shall keep." In this verse, God is showing us that he is in charge of the world. He's saying, if you are on my team, you have to abide by my rules. God said, "Ye shall keep the Sabbath, therefore it is holy unto you." When we are told to keep something, that means we hold on to it. We do not let it go. God's people were to treat the Sabbath differently from other days of the week. They were to do their work in 6 days and then give God the seventh day. The point in this is those in a covenant relationship with God are to recognize his authority and his leadership. He has a right to issue his commands, and the people have a duty to obey those commands to remain in covenant relationship with him. The keeping of the Sabbath was not merely an outward action. It was a way to show a sign between God and his people. And he said it was to be kept throughout the generations. That ye may know, he said, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doeth sanctify you. See, observing it was a weekly reminder of how God had brought them from a mighty long way, how God had redeemed them, how God had saved them from labor as a slave. He also was showing how he had sanctified them, how he had set them apart, how he was making them a nation into his likeness. And furthermore, it was to be a sign to be in effect throughout the generations. It wasn't just for them, it was to be continually done down through the generations. So, what is the primary meaning of the word Sabbath? Since the Hebrew word translated Sabbath comes from a word meaning to stop or to cease, the concept of refraining from ordinary work was inherent in the very word chosen from this commandment. The point we want to make is this here: God makes his expectations clear to all men that they are to cease from anything being done on the Sabbath. The Sabbath day was to be remain holy unto the Lord. Question 2 says, how was the Sabbath a sign between Israel and God? Like the rainbow in Genesis 9 and 17, or the circumcision in 17 verse 11, God said the Sabbath is a sign between me and you. You are to keep it throughout the generations. And this was to show them that Israel's law and other ancient moral codes, that the Sabbath was unique to Israel. It was showing them that they were set apart. It was showing that they had a covenant between them and God. See, the point is, as God's people, we live lives that are set apart for his purpose. The sign of God's Sabbath has a connection to sanctification and covenantal relationship. We also want to be sanctified and in covenant relationship with God. So the purpose of that statement, God's command to his people, was to show them at the Sabbath that you may know that I am the Lord that doeth sanctify you. The word sanctify is the common term for making something holy. It is the thing that we use that distinguish that we are set apart for God's use. The point of God's covenant of dealing is to create a people for himself who learn and display his ways to the world. Because we belong to him, we are to be devoted to his purposes. This is one of the vital reasons why entering into a relationship with God is so important. When we understand that we are in relationship with him and our part of the relationship means that we must be loyal and obedient to God. God then promised to be a provider and protector for us as a result. See, by doing so, we acknowledge God as the center of our authority of our lives. We then commit our lives to obeying him. We recognize his prerogative to issue commands and we follow them by applying them to our lives. We are acknowledging that we live to obey him. We seek to glorify him, his power, his sovereign authority over our lives. This here brings about more than just going through simple religious rituals. No, it shows us how following God and doing what God says do, how it impacts our lives. God's covenant with us calls us to daily service. It calls us to daily obedience. It calls us to be daily aware of who he is and where he fits into our lives. See, the sign of the covenants are reminders of God's leadership in our lives. See, sanctification is more than just consecration or cleansing. The word also means to be set apart. Therefore, by taking a day of rest from work, the nation of Israel was doing something different that no other nation was doing. They were placing their trust in God to help them complete the work in 6 days, and they were trusting him to make things grow, even though they didn't go out and work on the seventh day. Verses 14 through 15 read, "And ye shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy unto you. Everyone that defileth it shall surely be put to death. For whosoever doeth any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days may work be done, but in the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whosoever doeth any work in the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death." Verse 14 shows the serious consequences of not being obedient to God. If a person rejected God's Sabbath commandment, this was a reflection of what was going on the inside of a person. He had a rebellious spirit or a rebellious heart. He was stiff-necked. Even though God desired the heart of man to be solely on him, to be in breach of this covenant relationship with the Lord was the reason for this command. Notice what it is. That soul shall be cut off from among his people. To be cut off from amongst your people, your soul cut off, means there are no soul ties. You don't have anything that's related to the people who are set apart. You are something completely different. See, there are two reasons for giving the Sabbath observance. First is a reminder that God rested for his labor on creation. And second is a reminder that Israelites were slaves in Egypt with no days of rest. And the Sabbath was to have a sanctifying influence designed to keep the family together and separated from the Gentile nations. This was all part of making them holy, to set them apart. And to fail to do so, one must realize that they were going against the will and command of God. He called them out to be different, to be unique, to be different from the world. Question 3 says, what was the punishment for violating the Sabbath commandment? The Sabbath was a holy time for the Jewish nation. It was an important part of their relationship with God. And therefore, if you broke it, they had some severe consequences. And those consequences, in the text, it says, they surely be put to death. He says, everyone that defileth it shall surely be put to death. So to violate the Sabbath was considered a capital crime. Violators would be considered disloyal. They were considered to be outcasts. And therefore, the death penalty was instituted for anybody who broke this here command. This shows again that God was serious about his Sabbath. Question 4 says, what is the difference between the Sabbath and the Lord's Day? Since the Sabbath was the seventh day of the week and the Lord's Day is the first day of the week, They're not exactly the same. And allow me to explain a little bit. The Sabbath begins on Friday at sunset, and it ends on Saturday at sunset, and was the day of complete rest from all labor, symbolic of God's resting on the seventh day. The Sabbath was a sign to the Israelites that they had been set apart as followers of the Most High God. Their keeping of the Sabbath would help distinguish them again from any other nation. Now, Sunday is now looked as the Lord's Day, and it's set aside for that. The reason being, it was the day that Christ rose from the dead, as we read in John 20 and 1. Many believers gather on the first day of the week to celebrate this victory that Christ had over sin and death, and they now call it the Lord's Day. So that's the difference between the Sabbath and the Lord's Day. Question 5 says, what is one reason Christ had conflicts with the Pharisees over the Sabbath? Christ, when confronted by the Pharisees regarding his supposed breaking of the Sabbath, was because the Pharisees added legalistic ways to the Sabbath commandment. They added extra things to it, and it made it so difficult to keep. So the Sabbath was not intended to burden people, but to ease burden. The second reason you look at this is Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, meaning he's in charge of the Sabbath. So if he's in charge of the Sabbath, the Pharisees couldn't put their own rules to the Sabbath and place these burdens and then think that they could rebuke the lawgiver, because Christ was the Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is also the Lord of the Sabbath in that the Sabbath pointed to the rest Jesus provides us. Jesus became our rest today. And when he did all the work necessary for our salvation that we can find in Hebrews chapter 4, he fulfilled the law and the prophets. Romans 10 and 4 says, Christ is the culmination of the law so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. We rest spiritually in him as he has secured our eternal blessing. See, as believers, we're set free in Christ. See, Colossians 2, verses 16 and 17 read, therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to religious festivals, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. See, in the Lord, in Jesus Christ, again, we find rest. We find rest because he is the Lord of the Sabbath, and he has freed us to be able to worship him in spirit and in truth. Question 6 says, in what sense was the Sabbath to be holy to the Lord? This means that it was to be different from other days. See, it was to be a day of physical rest and also a day of worship. They would not worry about work. Their mind and everything was focused only on God. Verse 16 reads, wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. This here verse shows us that all believers have a responsibility to teach the next generation to worship and obey God. My mother taught me something many years ago, that every generation gets wiser but weaker. And what she meant is that every generation gets wiser in the things of the world, but grows weaker in the things of God. We have a responsibility to continually teach them to revere God. We must teach our children to obey the word of God and also understand that it cannot be about what they want, but they must learn to surrender their will to the will of God. If we do not, we'll lose a generation. And if we lose a generation, it will take years upon years upon years to recover from it. The time is now that we must allow our kids to understand the truth about surrendering to God, obeying his word, and doing the things that please him versus always doing the things that please the flesh. Verses 17 and 18 read, it is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. And he gave unto Moses, when he had made an end of communion with him upon Mount Sinai, 2 tablets of testimony, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. We see here that God, after he gave the commandments to God, he re-emphasized the Sabbath. He re-emphasized the importance of the Sabbath. And then God gave Moses the tablets of stone to take back down to the people. So, question 7, what did the Lord reiterate about the Sabbath? The Lord continues to reiterate that it's a sign of a covenant between him and his people. Question 8 says, what do you think it means that God rested and was refreshed? It shows us here that on the seventh day, God rested in the creation of the world. And the word rested in Hebrew comes from a word that shows us, like I said, that the same word that Shabbat comes from. It shows us to cease doing something. The word refresh comes from a Hebrew word meaning to breathe. This should be not construed to mean that the eternal God literally needed refreshment after his creative work was completed. No, God did not need that. God is a God who does not sleep. He does not need rest. God was setting up a system to allow man to demonstrate the grace of God through the Sabbath. See, the point is, God's people are renewed through worship and strengthened as they remember who he is and what he has done for them. See, we benefit from the grace of God as we rest. Rest allows us to be refreshed and thus strengthened physically, but we also blessed as we honor and worship him on the day he set aside. It brings about a spiritual enrichment as well. Question 9 says, what was engraved on the tablets of stone the Lord gave to Moses? The Lord gave Moses 2 tablets of stone. These tablets of stone contain the 10 commandments of Israel. And the 10 commandments, we see again how he really truly emphasized the Sabbath to make sure it was understood how important it is. Question 10 says, what is meant by the finger of God? The finger of God may simply mean that they were written by the power of God. See, the point is man's standards can change from day to day when it's written by man's hand. But when it's written by God's hand, it endures the test of time. It never ends. It never ceases. It never fails. This concludes our lesson. The Sabbath is a holy day set aside for man. God commanded that it be honored and kept. I pray that you set a day that you can honor God in the manner he desires and deserves. I pray that you realize the significance of honoring and praising and worshiping God, and also the significance of resting. We need physical rest in order to get spiritually charged up as well. Well, I pray that you've enjoyed this lesson. If so, please leave us a comment. Also, subscribe and like our channel. Well, that's all for this week. Come back next week. Same time, same channel. Be blessed now.